Hello and welcome to part 3 of this Armored Core series. Today we begin by looking at Armored Core 3, released in 2002. The story is, at its core, basically another take on the setting and story of AC-1, with some interesting twists. In this similar but new continuity, humanity is living underground after cataclysmic events on the surface. Their lives are dictated by their AI overlord, the Controller, whose instructions determine the operations of society, with some rebellious exceptions. Corporate warfare runs rampant, as you would expect, and some treat the Controller basically as their god, and that's where it gets interesting. The combination of the mechanical and the divine is a cool, thought-provoking concept, and where the story takes that is executed well, admittedly in a pretty minimalist fashion as you may expect. A lot of the presentation of the game reinforces this concept. The layers of the city resemble computer parts and microchips. The beautiful main menu of the global cortex resembles a glowing halo of information with electronic traces running beneath. It's a really interesting setting and one that I wish could have been explored even further. The game starts off on the right foot with a great opening mission. Visually, it's similar to the first stage in AC2, but where that was a linear track through a set piece with lots of detail, AC3 opens it up and places you amongst the buildings, able to fly around and land on rooftops to better snipe the enemy units. The scale feels perfect. It also introduces the new consort system right away, in that you have a partner AC working with you. In AC3, many missions allow you to hire a partner or two, some of which are MTs, some of which are things like helicopters, and some of which are ACs. The missions in general are excellent. They're a massive improvement over the last few games in nearly every regard. They're well balanced, paced, and feature what feels like a renewed sense of inspiration and polish. Visually, they are usually far more dynamic in terms of stage geometry, texture work, and effects, and combine to create a believable, immersive world. There's lots of inspired scenarios here. For example, an underwater mission on a sinking vessel, with a timer in the form of an imminent hull breach. Almost all the AC3 missions have background music, but in this one, your ambient audio is the sounds of the metal exterior creaking and bulging under pressure. Another stage featuring immersive ambient audio is this jungle mission in the rain.
System engaged.
Enemy forces detected in the vicinity. Get moving.
There are again a few duplicate missions from other titles. The Rebel Workers with converted construction equipment, again from AC1 Returns, but these are few and far between and usually feature a novelty or twist not present in the original. There is another almost entirely inanimate big spider boss. This particular one looks like it could be the ancestor of the armor spider, design-wise. One noticeable improvement on that kind of thing is this mission with the big flying MT that feels like a precursor to the arms forts we will see later on in the fourth generation of AC. There are 49 missions in total, and I happily did them all. A new category of parts, and by extension, customization, are the Exceed Orbit cores. They're core pieces that trade the ability to overboost for a couple of small units with their own AI to help you. These units do consume your energy while firing, but they also recharge their ammo while not in use. There is now a ranking system for your performance in the missions, and the acquisition of some secret parts are contingent on getting an A or S ranking in certain missions. Emails in the arena return after their absence from AC2 Another Age. The emails now feature nicely animated corporate logos within that add character. In the arena, replays, finally, no longer auto-load after the match ends, saving what probably amounts to at least 10 minutes of time throughout a playthrough. Early arena fights are conservative in cash rewards, but parts are sometimes given as well. The relatively lower payout for these initial fights encourages you to get out there and do missions, meaning that your experience is potentially less lopsided in terms of balance if you try on initially just focusing on one mode over the other. The AI of arena opponents seems to be improved, with an overall smoother difficulty curve versus past games. Alternate camera angles in replay are back as well. The options are between you, your opponent, and a dynamic one that changes angles and attempts to be cinematic with mixed results. Sometimes this results in some cool shots, but the other 50% of the time it usually gets stuck behind an object or is straight up not pointing at the action. There's also an unlockable extra arena after completing the normal one. This adds some variety in that it's all 2v2. The arena maps themselves are alright, nothing to write home about. About the same kind of layouts from the last couple of games. I still really miss the more unique and dynamic ones from Master of Arena. Human Plus has been replaced by the OP Intensify system. Basically, this is a part awarded to you after completing the game, which then has the classic Human Plus abilities added to it as rewards for certain post-game challenges. This means it's a reward for skilled players instead of a crutch for inexperienced ones, for better or for worse. It also means that you can't utilize it until the game is actually already basically over. It can be imported along with your file into the next game. However, the controls and handling in Armored Core 3 are a noticeable improvement over the AC2 generation. Things generally feel faster, smoother, and snappier. The overall handling is closer to the AC1 games, but with even less transitional time between changing directional movement. The only thing I still liked more about that era's controls is the air strafing. Otherwise, Armored Core 3 is the best feeling in the series so far. The energy consumption rates are also similar to AC1 in that they are much lower, meaning you can zip around and fly again at a pace that feels very fun and unrestrictive. Little things like the shifting of directions also takes less time. Landing from reasonable heights doesn't lock you up for a bit like the AC2 gen. Menu navigation, however, is 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. The part menus don't loop in deceiving ways again like they did in Another Age, but as far as I could tell, there is no way to directly compare the stats of the part currently equipped versus the ones you're looking at in the shop, which seems like a glaring omission considering that the AC2 games did have that. Switching between ACs is actually displayed properly in the menu this time, however. Placing the shop within the garage menu streamlines the building process a little bit. A nice new feature is that the dedicated arms parts that have built-in weapons all have toggle modes, providing a nice bit of variety with them. Models and texture work here look great. There's a pretty big step up in the presentation here. The game frequently looks very good. There's lots of visual variety and overall a great use of color. I mentioned this earlier, but it's not just technical or artistic improvement. Nearly every mission feels handcrafted and detailed in a way that feels like a massive leap forward for the series so far. It feels like there is a clear and coherent art direction for the entire experience, in contrast to some of the more scattershot elements of the last couple of games. There were also some new additional effects like a heat wave for boosters, environmental damage like glass windows shattering, the ACs themselves starting to spark and smoke when they're low on AP. There's also bullet casings that now eject from the shell-based weapons, and is especially impressive looking on the machine guns. The music in AC3 is a departure from the previous titles. It's still broadly electronic, but in a more serious and conservative style. It's aiming to be more cinematic, featuring a lot of dramatic staccato strings and orchestral elements. There are a few central melodic motifs found in a lot of the tracks, which I always appreciate. That being said, I did find the vocal elements used in several of the tracks here to be kind of cheesy. There are still some great tracks, but overall I was kind of lukewarm to this OST compared to the previous titles. I really enjoyed Armored Core 3. It's tied with the original game for my favorite in the series so far. From a gameplay perspective, it is almost certainly the best, for me anyway. The missions are so good, the difficulty feels balanced, and the overall storyline and experience are well done and satisfying. The only things preventing it from taking the #1 spot for me is the somewhat anticlimactic endgame and the final encounter. Every game up until this point had either a memorable last set of missions in the form of challenge or just the scenario, the best of which, like AC1, Master of Arena, and AC2 that had both. AC3 kind of rushes the story conclusion, and the final encounter kind of stumbles over the finish line. The ending cinematic is rewarding though, and is probably the best overall conclusion out of any of these games so far in that regard. Definitely be replaying this one in the future. The next game is Silent Line, released in 2003. It's the direct sequel to 3 and takes place back on the surface of the Earth. The Corpos are doing their thing, and humanity is doing pretty good, with the exception of those on the frontier of the area known as the Silent Line, where numerous mysterious attacks are happening from an unknown force. You are, as always, an impartial element in this mix, and of course end up getting involved. Silent Line is a solid game, but feels like a bit of a downgrade from some of the aspects that made AC3 so great. You start to get the feeling that the non-numbered titles in this series maybe had less of a budget, or maybe a smaller team working on them, or perhaps both. While there are still lots of well-designed missions, the level of polish and diversity of scenarios from AC3 have taken a step back. On some level, you can rate the campaign of any Armored Core title by how many redundant gray mazes you have to go through, and this game has quite a few. But there are still quite a few memorable missions, especially in the first half of the game. Some notable ones for me were the stealth mission, where you had to evade the spotlights of searching helicopters, followed by a siege on the base, followed by a 2v2 match with ACs. This one where you defend an area while an orbital cannon is raining massive plasma beams down on you. In general, there are a lot of defend the target missions, but they are basically all fun and unique in some way. Like this one at an airport where you need to destroy incoming missiles, or this one where you basically need to survive against a tough enemy AC and swarms of attack helicopters until the base's laser turrets come back online and decimate your opponent. There's an early Mirage mission that has you creating a diversion by mowing down a bunch of innocent people on a highway. You even get paid bonuses for each one, including the highest tier for taking out buses full of people. The missions do get a bit weaker as the game goes on. The conclusion kind of feels like they suddenly remembered the Silent Line concept, and it's all resolved pretty quickly. The last encounter in the game is well designed from a gameplay perspective, but I unfortunately did not find it super memorable. The mission selection menu now features a nice map, which then zooms in with a 3D topographical selection for the mission briefing. The mission acceptance pop-up defaults to cancel for some reason here, which means if you mash your way through a description, you're gonna have to do it all over again. Like every AC direct sequel before it, this game utilizes the same exact main menu and accompanying music as AC3. I really wish they were different because the menu design and music for AC3 felt particularly attuned to that game's setting and storyline, and it feels a little odd to have the same exact thing here. I'm not sure why this happened, but it's worth noting. When I imported my save from AC3, I lost 5 million credits. So if you're bringing your file over from AC3, you might want to cash out on parts beforehand and then resell them once you're in Silent Line. The arena is here as you would expect. The multiplayer maps have a couple of new additions. Treen City and Military District are both great. There is some additional options only available in the dedicated 1v1 PvP mode that are very good. Military District has the exploding buildings which look better than ever and collapse in a more dynamic way rather than a toggle state like back in AC2. The layouts for these two stages make Silent Line the best contender for multiplayer action since Master of Arena. The multiplayer replays still offer that cinematic camera angle option, but it hasn't really improved. This is a small detail, but patterns for AC paint jobs are finally back, allowing for greater visual customization. There's also now a formal option for playing in a first-person perspective. This has been a secret toggle via button combinations in several of the previous titles, but is properly selectable in menu now. It's an interesting novelty, but the game is definitely a lot harder to play from this perspective, considering the limited field of view and the overall speed of the game. Another interesting addition here is the ability to program your AI for your ACs. By registering any of your ACs as an AI AC, you have the ability to play as them in the arena. In doing so, you are training it. Each match you play like this will train the AI to fight more and more like you, but it's a pretty serious time investment to get any good results out of this. You can then use this trained AI as a teammate in the extra arena, or you can create multiples in order to create a whole new ladder to fight against in the AI arena. Unfortunately, you cannot use them as consorts during missions, which I think would have been the coolest thing that they could have actually been used for. The game's soundtrack again has electronic elements back in the mix, still with the string flourishes present, but slightly less prominent than they were in AC3. Scrambling Film in particular is a fantastic track and is up there with the best of the series. Overall, Silent Line is an enjoyable experience and one I would recommend if you liked AC. I don't think it's on that same level, but it is one of the better AC expansion pack type games. Our next game, and the final one for today, is Armored Core Nexus, released in 2004. This game continues the AC3 storyline, with the corporations doing their thing and continuing to expand on Earth's surface. There's really not much to talk about there. It's the standard AC setup without any kind of novel flourishes. There are no voiceovers for mission briefings in this one, which does remove some character from the various corporations. From Software has finally added the option for proper twin-stick controls here. And unlike the implementation of it for movement only in the previous titles, there's actually variable speed, if only slightly. Looking around also has variable speed as well. Both categories are still dictated by your build, of course. I have to admit that after playing all of these previous games, it did feel pretty weird at first switching to this more modern control scheme, but after adjusting, it's definitely a smoother way to go. Unfortunately, it feels like we're on a downward trajectory in terms of mission quality again. AC3 started so strong and continued like that for the duration of the entire campaign. Silent Line was a bit of a downgrade in this regard, but it still had lots of interesting scenarios. Nexus, in comparison, starts in a nondescript gray canyon. The third mission of Nexus is to shoot as many boxes as possible in a tiny gray warehouse. Things definitely improve as the game goes on, but the campaign is the weakest in the series, next to Another Age. You get an early email indicating that your arena ranking will determine the unlocking and payment for certain missions, but there is no dedicated arena mode, at least at first. Only matches predetermined by the campaign at certain points, and no ability to choose the map for those matches like the previous games. There is a ranking ladder visible from the main menu at any time, but there are no more character or world building type profiles here. They're just basically clinical combat ability, which is again a big mistake. There is a new mechanic here called tuning. This allows you to spend cash improving individual part variables, which allows for even greater customization. Interestingly, there's a similarity to the growth formulas found in the Souls games, in that the stat increase per investment point is usually non-linear and leads to diminishing returns after hitting certain soft caps. Tuning is a great addition that adds another satisfying layer to building your AC. One useful example was being just slightly overweight in a build I had put together, but by increasing the max weight stat on my leg parts, I was able to bypass the overweight movement penalty. Unfortunately, Nexus also has a fair share of head-scratching design decisions. For the first time in the series, the parts in this game lose value as soon as you use them in a mission or tune them in any way. Think about what that does to encourage experimenting with parts, and by extension, potential diversity in gameplay. This makes even less sense considering that tuning the parts not only immediately flags them as used, but it also brings down the price of a part. Shouldn't it be the other way around? If I've invested tens of thousands of credits into an individual part, shouldn't the value of it go back up? It's not like they're depreciating in condition, they're back to 100% after each mission anyway. So what's up with this? Cash basically becomes irrelevant by the halfway point of the campaign anyway, as the missions generally shower you in credits, making this change basically pointless, and upending the in-game cash management aspect system pretty much completely. You also can't sell your starter parts, probably implemented as a safety precaution to prevent you from soft-locking yourself, due to the changes to selling I mentioned a second ago. This also means it takes a bit longer to get a unique AC build going. Once again, you are able to see whether each part's stat is better or worse than the current equipped one while in the shop, but not the specific numerical difference. This means you need to either go back and forth between the equipment menu and the shop screen and compare the specific parts with the numbers either fresh in mind or written down, or purchase the part and compare the two in the equipment menu and then resell it if you decide not to keep it. I really don't understand why a basic numeric comparison was only in the AC2 games so far. In another questionable design decision, they went way overboard with the heat mechanic in this one. Even boosting increases it now. You can forget about overboosting. And now, in addition to draining your health when it gets too high, heat drains your energy as well. Check out this AC I put together that can't boost for more than a few seconds, with no other contributing factors before it overheats. It takes the best generator in the game in order to compensate for the heat generated from powerful boosters, meaning the best way to go until you can afford that stuff is a big, tanky AC. Energy weapons are also poorly balanced and consume way too much energy with each shot, rendering most of them useless. Some of the solid round weapons now need to reload as a bit of balancing. I don't think this is inherently a bad idea, as the machine guns were pretty overpowered in AC3 and Silent Line, but they again went way too far here. In one crazy example, there's a chain gun that has a 24 round magazine. Nexus is loaded with these kinds of oddities. The menus now render in 30 FPS, which makes navigation in them feel sluggish and choppy. It is still 60 FPS in gameplay, fortunately. Another element of the main menus is that the music doesn't loop properly. The track ends, and then awkwardly starts up again out of time with itself. The difficulty here is pretty inconsistent. It's pretty brutal to start, especially considering the aforementioned mechanics and that you can't import your save from Silent Line. But it also feels like it doesn't actually get any harder until the very end, meaning the middle 80% potentially becomes a cakewalk once you can afford some decent parts and start overcoming the heat and generator limitations. That being said, there is no way for the player to utilize Human Plus, OP Intensify, or any kind of equivalent, and yet the AI still gets to. And because of the crazy balancing in this game, it is very, very obvious when the AI gets to. There are more repeated missions from past games in here. Fight the giant inanimate AC again. At least this one has a bit more of a destruction animation. The repeated scenarios here are pretty ironic considering that the second disc of this game consists of a bunch of remade stages from the PS1 games as a bit of a celebration or look back at the series. But I'll get to those in a little bit. Visually, I felt that the game frequently looked worse than either of the previous titles, both due to a lack of cohesive art direction as well as a lack of detail, like this extremely basic looking city stage with a total lack of cars, streetlights, or anything like that. The environments frequently feel a bit lifeless. Compare this to a similar scenario in AC3. On top of this, there is now a blur filter active at all times during gameplay. I think the attempt was to simulate depth of field, but the end result are visuals that look really fuzzy. This looks poor on original hardware and the CRTs of the era as well, and within Emulation. This can be mitigated to some extent within PCSX2, using some custom settings that I'll share at the end of the video. Musically, the game is decent. There are a few memorable tracks. It's more pure electronic again, like Silent Line, with a few tracks still utilizing that cheesy vocal sample. The mood of lots of these tracks are more upbeat, akin to the AC1 and 2 generations. Some are cool, some are not, and some sound like wrestling entrance music.
I've never seen anything like this in my life!
Towards the endgame, there are these short, moody, pre-rendered videos upon losing the last couple of missions. I'm not sure what their story relevance is. They're not alternate endings because you do get to keep playing, but they look nice at least. The ending to this one is pretty unusual for the series and I've got to admit, pretty cool. It's surprisingly cinematic for something that happens entirely in-game. There's not much to say about multiplayer, other than the fact that most of the maps are from Silent Line. After completing the Disc 1 campaign, the post-game works a little differently than the prior games. The campaign essentially resets, but you have separate new menus where previously played missions can be replayed, as well as any of the arena matches. In another change I'm not sure I'm keen on, this list does not include missions that you didn't complete, meaning that to 100% the game you'll need to do at least 2 playthroughs. Now this isn't the same thing as having a completely separate progression route, where you didn't have the chance to do the missions at all. This does add replayability, but I think I would prefer having the option to cleanly finish up the missions I had the opportunity to do, but that I hadn't done yet. Disc 2, as mentioned earlier, is a collection of remade stages from the PS1 trilogy of AC games. The main menu has a different design here, more akin to that era, and the menu music is a new version of Shape Memory Alloy, the menu music from those games. The mission briefings are actually voiced here, unlike the campaign on Disc 1. There's not much to say about these remade missions. I wasn't exactly feeling nostalgic about them, given that I've played all of them within the last few months, and even with their older, clunkier controls, I would rather replay them in their original games. Beating missions here unlocks various bits of art, movies, and promotional material from previous releases. In conclusion for AC Nexus, well, as you've probably gathered by this point, I don't think it's all that great. The campaign on the first disc improves as it goes on, but it never rises anywhere near the highs of the preceding games. With the weird balancing, inconsistent presentation, and general lack of new elements and ambition, it definitely falls towards the bottom of my AC ranking list so far. I don't see myself replaying this one, and I can't really recommend it either. Although the controls are certainly more welcoming to new players and those accustomed to modern control schemes, the core mechanics are very newbie unfriendly, and just generally kind of ill-conceived. With that out of the way though, let's talk about the best ways to play these 3 games. Both Armored Core 3 and Silent Line run really well in PCSX2 as of the making of this video. Even more so than the previous games, they look great rendered in high resolutions thanks to the higher polygon count and texture detail, but they do require a bit of tinkering to really look their best. With either game open in PCSX2, click Settings, Game Properties, and then the Graphics tab. This will allow you to customize settings on a per game basis without tweaking them for every game in your library. Here are my settings. Feel free to copy them and tweak as you see fit. Both games had ports to the PlayStation Portable, and they are essentially the same experience there, with a difference in some minor details, downgraded visuals, and redesigned menus. I say stick to the PS2 versions. Nexus also requires some tweaking in PCSX2. Here are my settings. Access them in the same way I described for the previous games a minute ago. So that covers the first half of the 3rd generation of Armored Core. Next time we'll be looking at the remaining 3rd generation titles, Formula Front, Ninebreaker, and Last Raven. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
We'll be right back.